hadn't been back to Lancaster in years. The small, sleepy town nestled in the heart of New England had a way of pulling you in, making you feel safe, only to slowly squeeze the life out of you. As a kid, I used to love it. There was something about the stillness, the way the trees closed in on the town like they were keeping secrets, or maybe just hiding us from the rest of the world. I drove past the old elementary school, now abandoned and overgrown with weeds, and felt a chill run down my spine. The memories started coming back. Some good summer bike rides, the smell of burning leaves in the fall, the sound of kids laughing as we played in the streets. But mostly it was the darker memories. That Halloween night, the night everything changed. I had come back for my mother's funeral. She had passed quietly in her sleep, as I suppose people in towns like this often do. There's no violence, no dramatic endings, just a slow fade into nothingness. After the service, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. Something about this town had unfinished business with me, and I could feel it tightening around my throat, daring me to stay. The house was exactly how I remembered it. Small, quaint, and filled with echoes of the past. Every creak of the floorboards brought back memories of my childhood. But as I stood there, staring out the kitchen window into the dense woods behind the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to remember. I spent the afternoon unpacking the few belongings I'd brought, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. Around sunset, I decided to go for a walk. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my boots as I wandered through the familiar streets. It was almost Halloween again. The decorations were already going up, just like they used to. Skeletons, pumpkins, fake cobwebs, the usual stuff. But then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Hanging in the window of the old shop on Main Street, the one that had been boarded up for years, was one of his masks. The masks we all used to wear on Halloween. Handmade by Mr. Donovan, the town's resident mask maker. He was an odd man, to say the least. Thin, gaunt, with a permanent look of weariness etched into his face. But everyone in town loved his masks. They weren't like the cheap plastic ones from the store. No, these were different. They were works of art, each one unique, crafted with an almost unnatural precision. I hadn't thought about those masks in years, but seeing one now, after everything that happened, made my stomach turn. Why would someone display that? No one had talked about Mr. Donovan in years. Not since my best friend Tommy. I didn't let myself finish the thought. I turned and walked quickly back to the house, the chill in the air suddenly biting. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to keep my mind from drifting to that Halloween night 20 years ago. Tommy had been so excited to wear his mask. It was one of Mr. Donovan's best, a grotesque, twisted face that looked almost too real. The rule had always been the same. You could wear the mask all night, but never after midnight. Tommy didn't care about the rule. He said it was stupid, just an old town superstition. So he kept the mask on. And after that, Tommy wasn't the same. He became distant, strange. He wouldn't talk about what had happened, but I could see it in his eyes. He was scared. And then, a few weeks later, he was gone. Moved away, they said. His family just up and left in the middle of the night. No one ever saw him again. The sound of something knocking against the front door snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Who the hell would be out at this time? I hesitated before getting out of bed, my heart racing. The knocking came again, louder this time. I threw on a shirt and made my way downstairs. The hallway was dark, only the faint glow of the street lamp outside illuminating the front door. I took a deep breath and opened it. There, on the doorstep, was a package. No note, no explanation. Just a plain brown box. I brought it inside, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a mask. Not just any mask. Tommy's mask. The same grotesque, twisted face stared up at me, its hollow eyes almost gleaming in the dim light. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This couldn't be real. Tommy had taken that mask with him when he disappeared. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But as I stood there, holding the mask in my hands, I could feel something wrong. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, colder. The mask felt warm to the touch, almost like it was alive. A whisper, faint and distant, reached my ears, though I couldn't make out the words. My hands started to tremble, and I dropped the mask back into the box, slamming it shut. I should have thrown it away, burned it, but I couldn't. Some part of me was curious, desperate to know the truth about what happened to Tommy, about what that mask was. The clock struck midnight, and I knew tonight I would find out. I couldn't stop staring at the box. Even though I'd closed it, I felt the mask inside, watching me. The air in the room had gone stale, thick with the kind of tension you only feel when you're not alone. And I wasn't. Not anymore. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, startling me. I grabbed it, hoping for a distraction, something to pull me out of this growing sense of dread. But when I looked at the screen, the message wasn't what I was expecting. Don't wear it. It was from an unknown number. I stared at the message, my mind racing. How could anyone know about the mask? I hadn't told a soul. I hadn't even left the house. My first instinct was to delete the message and forget about it. But a strange curiosity gnawed at me. Who could have sent it? And why? I typed back quickly, my fingers shaking. Who is this? The 3 dots appeared almost instantly, but no response came. The dots flickered on and off for a few minutes, then stopped altogether. Nothing. I threw the phone down, my frustration mixing with a growing fear. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing in the house. I needed air, needed to get away from the mask, away from the creeping feeling of dread that had been swirling around me since I found it. Grabbing my jacket, I walked outside, the cold night air biting against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. The town was eerily quiet, as it always was this time of night. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the empty road. No wind, no sounds, just that oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over Lancaster after dark. I started walking aimlessly, my mind stuck on the mask, on Tommy, on the strange message. The memories I had buried for years were bubbling to the surface now, clawing their way out, demanding to be remembered. I hadn't thought about Tommy's disappearance in a long time. No one in town really talked about it after it happened. It was like everyone just decided to pretend he never existed, as if ignoring his absence would make the strangeness surrounding it disappear, too. But it didn't. Not for me. I remembered that night more clearly now, how Tommy had looked after midnight. We had been playing in the woods behind his house, running around with our masks on, laughing, pretending to be monsters. But as the hours ticked away and the clock neared 12, something changed. Tommy's laughter had died first. He'd become quiet, withdrawn, the mask glued to his face. It was like he had forgotten it was there, or worse, like he didn't want to take it off. I remember asking him to stop, to pull the mask off and go home. But he wouldn't. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes barely visible through the grotesque slits in the mask. And then, after midnight, his voice had changed. It wasn't Tommy anymore. It was someone else. Something else whispering from behind that mask. He said things I couldn't understand, things that didn't make sense. I'd run home that night, terrified, leaving him behind. And by morning, Tommy and his family were gone. Vanished. No one ever saw them again. The sound of footsteps behind me snapped me out of my thoughts. I spun around, but there was no one there. The street was as empty as it had been when I left the house. I started walking faster, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I could feel someone following me, though every time I turned to look, there was nothing. My pace quickened until I was nearly jogging, the sound of footsteps matching mine, always just a few feet behind. I made it to the park at the edge of town and stopped, my heart pounding, breath clouding the cold air in front of me. The footsteps had stopped too. I was alone again. I sank onto a bench, my hands shaking. I needed to calm down. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The mask, the memories, it was all getting to me. But as I sat there, the uneasy feeling of being watched grew stronger. Slowly, I looked up, my eyes scanning the darkened park. And then I saw it. Across the street, standing beneath a flickering street lamp, was a figure. Tall, thin, and dressed in a long coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. But it was the face, or what should have been the face, that sent ice shooting through my veins. It was wearing a mask. One of his masks. I froze, my mind reeling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring in my direction, the hollow eyes of the mask fixed on me. I blinked, and it was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. Was it real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? But the fear felt real. The terror clawing at the back of my mind, telling me to run, felt very real. I stood, forcing myself to move, my legs heavy with fear. As I started back toward my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. It wasn't just the mask. It was the town, the air, the sense that everything here had been waiting for me to return, for me to remember. When I got back to the house, the first thing I noticed was the box. It was no longer on the table where I'd left it. It was on the floor, open, and the mask was gone. I felt the panic rising in my chest. I searched the room frantically, looking for it, hoping it was just my imagination, but the mask was nowhere to be found. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I knew what it would say before I even picked it up. It's too late. I dropped the phone, my heart racing. Suddenly, there was a noise upstairs. A soft, scraping sound, like something or someone moving across the floor. My blood ran cold. Someone's in the house. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and slowly made my way to the staircase. The noise continued, steady, deliberate, as if it was trying to draw me closer. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, one step at a time, the wooden boards creaking beneath my weight. The sound was coming from my old bedroom at the end of the hall. I stopped outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath shallow. I could feel it. Something was behind that door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the thin curtains. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, in the corner of the room, something moved. And there, crouched in the shadows, was a figure, wearing Tommy's mask. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by a fear so deep it felt like my bones might shatter from the tension. The figure in the corner shifted slightly, the mask catching the pale light from the window. It was unmistakably Tommy's mask, the grotesque, twisted face that had haunted me for years. But the thing behind it, it wasn't Tommy. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, the hollow eyes of the mask staring back at me with a cold, lifeless gaze. My mind raced. Could it really be Tommy? After all these years, could he have come back? Or was it something else? Something wearing his mask? I took a step forward, gripping the lamp in my hand tightly, ready to swing if I had to. The figure tilted its head slightly, the mask seeming to breathe, to shift and twitch as if it were alive. My heart pounded louder in my chest, drowning out every rational thought. Then it spoke, but it wasn't Tommy's voice. The sound that came from behind the mask was distorted, low and gravelly, like someone, or something, was speaking through water. "You never should have come back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure took a step toward me, moving with an unnatural fluidity, like it wasn't bound by the same rules of movement as the rest of us. It was inhuman, wrong, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it. "You remember the rules, don't you?" the voice said, the mask seeming to pulse with every word. Never after midnight. My mind flashed back to that night all those years ago. Tommy had broken the rule. He had worn the mask after midnight, and now here I was standing face to face with the consequence of that choice. Whatever was behind that mask, it wasn't Tommy anymore. It was something else. Something ancient, something dark. You took him? I whispered, the realization dawning on me. You took Tommy. The figure didn't deny it. It just stood there watching me, waiting. I felt a surge of anger mix with my terror. For 20 years, I had lived with the guilt of leaving Tommy behind that night. For 20 years, I had tried to forget what happened, but it had never left me. And now, this thing was standing in front of me, wearing his face. What are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. Why are you doing this? The mask shifted again, as if it were smiling beneath its hideous surface. The voice that came next was colder, more sinister. The mask, it doesn't just hide you, changes you. It shows what you truly are, underneath all the flesh, all the lies. Tommy saw the truth. He became part of it. And now, so will you. I took another step back, my mind racing. The mask wasn't just a piece of cloth and leather. It was something far more powerful, something alive. It had taken Tommy, consumed him, and now it wanted me. I glanced at the door, calculating whether I could make a run for it, but I knew deep down that there was no escape. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me here. It had been waiting for me to come back, to finish what had been started all those years ago. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. I raised the lamp, ready to defend myself, but my hands were trembling so badly, I wasn't sure I could swing it hard enough to make a difference. The mask's hollow eyes seemed to widen, and I could feel it drawing me in, like it was trying to pull something out of me, to latch onto my soul. I had to do something. I couldn't let this happen. Not again. And then, without thinking, I blurted out, "What did you do to Tommy? Where is he?" The figure stopped, just inches away from me now. For a moment, there was silence. And then, in that same distorted voice, it whispered, "He's still here." A cold wave of dread washed over me. Still here? What did that mean? My mind raced, trying to comprehend what it was saying. "I am Tommy." The words hit me like a freight train. No, that couldn't be true. Tommy had disappeared. His family had left. I had convinced myself that he had moved far away, that he had escaped whatever had happened that night. But deep down, I had always known. The mask had taken him, twisted him into something else. The figure reached up, its hand moving toward the mask. My heart stopped as I watched, frozen in place. Slowly, it pulled the mask away from its face, revealing what was underneath. I wish I could say it was Tommy, that somehow my old friend was still there, but it wasn't. The face that stared back at me was unrecognizable. It was pale, gaunt, the skin stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. The eyes were sunken, hollow, filled with a darkness that went deeper than anything I had ever seen. And yet, there was something familiar in those eyes. A flicker of the boy I used to know, buried deep beneath the surface. "Tommy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thing that had once been my friend didn't respond. It just stared at me, its eyes full of something I couldn't quite understand. Anger, fear, maybe even sorrow. "You were supposed to help me?" it said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. "You left me there." The guilt hit me like a wave. I had left him. I had run when he needed me the most. And now, whatever this was, it was my fault. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. For a brief moment, the air in the room seemed to still, the tension lifting slightly. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The figure lunged at me, faster than I could react. I stumbled backward, dropping the lamp, the light flickering out as I fell to the floor. I could feel the weight of the mask in my hand, cold and heavy, as if it had a life of its own. The figure was on top of me now, its hollow eyes staring into mine, its voice a whisper in the darkness. "Put it on." The words slithered through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like tendrils. I fought against it, every instinct in me screaming to throw the mask away, to get as far from it as I could. But my hands wouldn't listen. They were already moving, already bringing the mask closer to my face. "No!" I screamed, trying to fight it, but it was too late. The mask was in my hands now, the fabric soft and warm against my skin. I could feel it pulsing, like a heartbeat. And then, as it touched my face, everything went black. When I woke up, the house was silent. The room was cold, and I was lying on the floor, the mask still clutched in my hands. But something was different. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had filled the room before was gone. I stood slowly, my body aching, my mind foggy. I looked down at the mask, now just a lifeless piece of fabric in my hands. Whatever power it had held over me was gone. But as I stared at it, I realized something. The mask had taken Tommy. It had almost taken me. But it was over now. The mask had no more power here. I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, empty street. The town looked the same as it always had, but I knew better. I knew the truth now, and I knew that, somewhere out there, the mask was still waiting for the next soul to take. Second story. I've never been one for ghost stories. Superstitions always seemed like something for children or the overly paranoid. But in my small town, there was one legend that even the most skeptical couldn't entirely ignore. It was about the Pumpkin Trail, an eerie path that supposedly appeared deep in the woods on Halloween night. It wasn't on any map, and the trail was said to vanish at the break of dawn. The town's elders claimed that anyone who followed the glowing pumpkins lining the path would have their darkest desires granted, at a price. No one who dared to walk it ever returned. Naturally, it was the kind of story that spread at bonfires and slumber parties every October. That year, however, the story became more than just campfire gossip for me and my friends. We were seniors, looking for something thrilling, something to prove we weren't scared of a silly myth. It was Halloween night, and after a few drinks and dares, the idea of following the pumpkin trail became the ultimate bet. "Come on, man. You're not chickening out, are you?" Ryan smirked, his voice thick with playful mockery. "Of course not." I shot back, though deep down, there was a twist of unease in my stomach. It's just a story, right? A little walk in the woods. Easy money. My friends, Ryan, Emily, and Jake all seemed equally excited. Emily was the one who heard the most about the legend. Her grandma swore she saw the trail when she was young, but something in the woods kept her from entering. Jake, always the practical one, figured the whole thing was just an old tale used to keep kids from wandering too deep into the forest. As for Ryan, well, Ryan loved any excuse for a bet, especially one that put money in his pocket. The plan was simple. We'd go out to the woods near the old Miller farm, find the trail, take a few selfies, and prove we were brave enough to face whatever lurked there. It wasn't like we'd actually see pumpkins glowing in the dark or anything. But the closer we got to the woods, the quieter it became. The cool October air was biting, and the rustling of leaves under our feet only added to the growing tension none of us wanted to acknowledge. The town was quiet, too, with most people inside, either trick-or-treating or enjoying Halloween parties. There was no one around to talk sense into us or tell us we were being ridiculous. Ryan led the way, flashlight in hand, while Emily clutched her phone, occasionally snapping pictures of us as we made our way down the overgrown path. The woods were denser than I remembered, their trees looming like silent sentinels. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I started to wonder if we'd find anything at all. "Look!" Emily's voice cut through the quiet. We all turned to where she pointed. There, flickering faintly in the distance, was a small, glowing light. As we approached, it became unmistakable. A perfectly carved jack-o'-lantern sat on the edge of a clearing, its hollow grin leering at us from the shadows. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered. "Someone's been busy." We all stood there for a moment, staring at the pumpkin, unsure of what to do next. Then, from behind it, another light flickered. Another jack-o'-lantern, and then another, forming a faint trail that stretched deeper into the woods. "This is it," Ryan said, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. The pumpkin trail. Against my better judgment, we followed the glowing pumpkins. At first, it felt like a Halloween attraction, a prank someone set up to mess with thrill-seekers like us. But as we continued, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease grew with every step. The pumpkins were too perfect, their faces carved with unnerving precision, their glow steady and unnatural. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, the forest around us growing darker and more oppressive. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. And that's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. "The pumpkins?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. "They're watching us." Emily glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "The faces," I said, my voice shaking. "They've changed. At first, they'd been simple, harmless grins. But now, as I looked closer, the expressions on the jack-o'-lanterns seemed to shift, becoming twisted, more sinister. Their eyes followed us, and their grins widened, as if they were waiting for something. "No way," Jake scoffed. "You're just freaked out." "Am I?" I shot back. "Take a closer look." Reluctantly, the others leaned in to examine the pumpkins. And that's when the wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying with it the faintest sound. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the shadows beyond the pumpkins. Emily grabbed my arm. "We should turn back." But Ryan shook his head, always the daring one. "No way. We've come this far." I glanced at Jake, hoping he'd be the voice of reason, but he just shrugged. What's the worst that could happen? With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized we were all in too deep to turn back now. As we took another step forward, the pumpkin's glow flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to close in, as if the woods were swallowing us whole. And then the trail disappeared. We were lost. Panic set in almost immediately after we realized the path was gone. The glowing pumpkins that had once seemed to guide us were nowhere in sight. One moment, the carved faces lit up the woods in a strange, eerie glow, and the next, we were enveloped by complete darkness. My flashlight flickered in my hand, its beam barely cutting through the dense, suffocating fog that seemed to settle over us. I don't understand," Emily stammered, clutching my arm tighter. "Where did they go?" "The pumpkins. They were right there." Ryan's cocky attitude evaporated in an instant. His face paled as he swung his flashlight around wildly, searching for any sign of the trail. Maybe we took a wrong turn?" he suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. "We didn't take any turns, Ryan," I said through gritted teeth, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail had been a straight line, marked clearly by the pumpkins. There was no way we could have gotten lost so easily. But here we were, surrounded by towering trees, their skeletal branches stretching toward us like claws. The forest was eerily silent now, not even the sound of the wind breaking the tension that thickened the air. "I knew this was a bad idea," Jake muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "We should have just stayed home." "No kidding," I shot back, the unease in my stomach growing into something more, something like fear. We huddled together, our breath visible in the cold night air. I could hear Emily's shaky breathing beside me, and even Ryan, usually so fearless, was gripping his flashlight like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Okay, Ryan said, his voice breaking through the thick silence. "Let's not freak out. We can't be that far from the road. We just need to retrace our steps." "But the trail's gone," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not gone," Ryan insisted, more to convince himself than us. "It's gotta be here somewhere. We just..." A loud crack echoed through the forest, cutting him off mid-sentence. We all froze, eyes wide, flashlights aimed in the direction of the sound. It was close, too close. "What was that?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one answered. Then we heard it again. A soft, deliberate rustling in the underbrush, like something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. Slowly, the noise grew louder, and I swear I could hear the faintest echo of whispers carried on the wind, just like before. But this time, the whispers weren't distant. They were near. Too near. "We need to get out of here," I said, taking a step back. "Where?" "There's no trail." Emily's voice trembled, and I could feel her panic rising. Ryan turned toward the direction we came from, or at least where we thought we'd come from. "We'll make our own way back. Screw the pumpkins." We started to move, fast but careful, the beams of our flashlights sweeping over the ground as we stumbled through the thick brush. But the woods seemed to twist and bend around us, like the trees themselves were shifting. Every direction looked the same: endless darkness, towering trees, and thick undergrowth. The longer we walked, the more disoriented we became. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A jack-o'-lantern. Its eerie orange glow flickered just ahead, its twisted grin more menacing than before. But there was something wrong about it. The light wasn't soft or warm like before. It was sharp, unnatural, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. "What the hell is going on?" Jake asked, voice laced with fear. "How is it following us?" The whispering returned, louder this time, surrounding us from all sides. It was impossible to make out what it was saying, but the tone was unmistakable, menacing, hungry. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting. "We need to go now," I urged, my voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, another pumpkin appeared, and then another, each one glowing brighter than the last. Their sinister faces twisted in ways that defied explanation. "We're being herded," Emily whispered, her face pale with terror. "They're leading us somewhere." "What are you talking about?" Ryan snapped, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. "It's just a prank. Someone's messing with us." "No," I said, my voice hollow. "This isn't a prank." The pumpkins lined the path once more, but this time, there was no turning back. The trail seemed to stretch out endlessly before us, the forest on either side growing darker, denser. And those damned whispers, they wouldn't stop. They were inside my head now, crawling under my skin, telling me to keep going, to follow the pumpkins. "They want us to finish the trail," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're waiting." "What happens when we reach the end?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But deep down, I knew that whatever was waiting at the end of this cursed trail, it wasn't something any of us wanted to meet. As we pressed forward, the pumpkin's glow grew stronger, the air thick with an unnatural chill. And in the distance, barely visible through the trees, I could see it. A shadow standing tall and still, waiting for us at the end of the trail. The figure in the distance stood completely motionless. Its shadowy outline was hard to make out, but it was unmistakably human in shape, standing right at the point where the glowing pumpkins seemed to converge. The whispers, which had been faint before, now grew louder, an unintelligible chorus of voices that sent chills racing down my spine. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in around us. "We need to turn back," Emily muttered under her breath, her eyes wide and terrified. She clutched my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin, but I couldn't feel the pain. All I could focus on was that shadow ahead. It seemed impossibly far yet unnervingly close all at once. "Turn back where?" Ryan hissed, his usual bravado gone. His voice cracked as he looked behind us. "There's no way out. The pumpkins are everywhere." He was right. The path behind us was now lined with jack-o'-lanterns, their eerie grins flickering with unnatural light. It was as if they had silently multiplied, trapping us on this trail that seemed to stretch infinitely forward and backward. "What do we do?" Jake whispered, the fear in his voice barely contained. His eyes darted from one glowing pumpkin to the next, like he expected them to spring to life at any moment. No one had an answer. The pumpkins continued to glow, their faces twisted and malevolent, watching us, waiting. And that figure at the end of the trail? It hadn't moved an inch, yet its presence grew stronger, as if it was drawing us in. "We keep moving," I said, my voice hollow. I couldn't explain why, but deep down, I knew we had no choice. The trail wasn't going to let us leave. Not unless we finished it. We walked in silence, our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath us, the only sound other than the whispering that seemed to surround us. Every few steps, I'd glance at the jack-o'-lanterns lining the path, half expecting their twisted faces to shift, to move. But they remained still, their grins mocking us, urging us forward. As we got closer to the figure, my breath caught in my throat. It was clearer now. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered black coat. His face was hidden by the shadows, but there was something about him that was deeply unsettling. It wasn't just his stillness. It was the way the darkness seemed to cling to him, like it was part of him, wrapping around him like a shroud. "Who is that?" Emily's voice trembled. "I don't think we want to find out," Jake muttered. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. The trail was guiding us, pulling us forward whether we wanted to go or not. Then, just as we were within a few yards of the figure, the jack-o'-lanterns lining the path suddenly dimmed. Their light flickered and waned, casting the forest in an eerie half-darkness. The whispers grew louder, clearer, but still impossible to understand until suddenly they weren't. "Come closer," the voice said. It was a low, rasping whisper, not from the pumpkins, but from the figure itself. "Finish the trail." I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my friends behind me, frozen in place, as the figure slowly raised its head. Two glowing eyes pierced the darkness, staring straight into mine. "We need to go," Emily whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Please, let's just go." But we didn't move. "Finish the trail," the figure repeated, its voice echoing through the trees. Ryan took a shaky step forward. "This is all just a prank," he said, though his voice betrayed the terror that was gripping him. "Right? Someone's messing with us." The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, waiting. The pumpkins glowed faintly behind us, their twisted grins frozen in place. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the darkness, the figure, it was all too much. I grabbed Emily's hand and turned to run. But as soon as I did, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. The forest around us blurred, the trees twisting and warping as if we were trapped in a nightmare. The pumpkin's light flared, blinding us for a moment. And when I opened my eyes, we weren't in the woods anymore. We were standing in a clearing. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and something far worse, something that reeked of death. The pumpkins were still there, arranged in a perfect circle around us, their grins wider than ever. And in the center of the clearing, standing on a pile of dirt and broken roots, was a large stone altar. The figure stood at the altar, its glowing eyes locked on us. What is this?" Jake stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure slowly raised one bony hand, pointing to the altar. "The trail ends here." My blood ran cold as I realized what he meant. This wasn't just a game. The legend was true. The trail didn't grant wishes, it took them, fed on them, and we were its next offering. "No," Emily whispered, backing away. "No, this can't be happening." But the ground beneath her cracked, and she stumbled, falling toward the altar. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and the pumpkin's light grew harsh and cold. "Finish the trail," the figure rasped once more, stepping toward us. I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her back, but it was no use. The ground was shifting beneath us, pulling us closer to the altar, to the figure, to whatever darkness lurked at the end of the trail. And then, with a final, deafening whisper, the pumpkin's light went out. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own screams as the darkness swallowed us whole. Third story. Halloween had always been a big deal in our small town. Every year, the streets would fill with kids in costumes, their bags heavy with candy by the end of the night. For teenagers like me, though, it wasn't just about the candy anymore, it was about the thrill. The rush of doing something stupid, something that could get you in trouble, and then laughing about it with your friends later. That's why, on this particular Halloween, we decided to push the limits. There was a house at the far end of Maple Street. It was old, run down, the kind of place you'd imagine ghosts living in. Every town has one of those houses, right? But this one had a story, a legend that kept even the bravest from knocking on the door. The story of the man with the lantern. They said every Halloween night, just as darkness fully settled in, a man would stand outside the house, holding an old lantern. No one knew who he was or where he came from, but the story went that anyone who knocked on the door and saw the man would disappear, vanished, gone without a trace. The next morning, there would be no sign of them, no lantern, no man, just silence. Naturally, my friends thought it was all bullshit. It's just some creepy old story parents tell to keep kids from wandering too far. Jake, the most daring of the group, had said, but as much as we tried to laugh it off, there was a tension in the air. Deep down, I think we all knew it wasn't just a story. That night, after hours of pranking neighbors and loading up on candy, we found ourselves standing at the edge of Maple Street, staring down at the house. The street was darker there, quieter. The wind seemed to pick up the closer we got, making the old trees sway and creak. "All right, who's going first?" Jake smirked, nudging me. I looked at the house, at its broken windows and the twisted, leafless tree in the front yard. No lights on inside, no decorations. It looked completely abandoned. But then, as we took another step, I saw him, the man. He stood near the door, just as the stories described. Tall and thin, with his head slightly bowed, holding a lantern in his right hand. The lantern's glow was dim, casting eerie shadows that made it hard to see his face. "See? Just some freak trying to scare kids." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, let's get this over with," I muttered, stepping forward. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the man, the way he stood there so still, gave me chills. But I couldn't back down now. They'd never let me live it down. I walked up the creaking porch steps, my footsteps sounding louder than I'd hoped. I stood at the door, the man just a few feet away, his lantern casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. My friends watched from the street, whispering and giggling nervously behind me. "Just knock already," one of them shouted. So I did. The sound echoed, much louder than it should have been. The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, ever so slowly, he lifted his head. Our eyes met, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. His face, it wasn't right. His eyes were sunken, almost hollow, and his smile, too wide, like it had been carved into his face. The lantern's light flickered, and then everything went dark. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden loss of light. My heart raced, my breathing quick and shallow. I could still feel the cold air on my skin, but the sounds of my friends, the wind, even the creaking trees, everything had vanished. There was only silence, and then the light returned. But this time it was coming from my hands. I looked down and there it was, the lantern, the same one the man had been holding. I spun around, expecting to see my friends, the house, something, but there was nothing, just darkness stretching out in all directions. I was alone, and yet I felt like I wasn't. There was something watching me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes on me, following my every move. My grip tightened on the lantern as I scanned the darkness, my breath quickening with each second that passed. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was coming for me, and I had nowhere to run. I don't know how long I stood there, gripped by a fear I'd never known before. It was as if time had ceased to exist. Everything was swallowed by the inky blackness surrounding me, except for the faint, flickering light of the lantern in my hands. My friends were gone. No voices, no laughter, nothing. It was just me, alone in that void, and something else. I could feel it out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. It wasn't just one thing, though. It felt like 100 eyes were on me, watching, waiting. I turned in circles, holding the lantern out in front of me like it was a shield, but it did little to chase away the feeling that I was being hunted. Then, from the distance, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It grew louder, a soft, rhythmic tapping like footsteps on stone. Tap, tap, tap. I whipped the lantern in the direction of the sound, but the light only illuminated a small radius around me, leaving the rest of the world shrouded in darkness. My pulse quickened. The footsteps were getting closer. "Jake? Ryan? This isn't funny," I called out, hoping, praying, that this was all just an elaborate prank. But the silence that followed felt suffocating, like the darkness itself was closing in around me. Then I saw it. Far in the distance, barely visible at the edge of the lantern's glow, a shape moved. My breath hitched in my throat as I strained to make it out. It wasn't a person, not exactly. The figure was tall, hunched, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to twitch unnaturally as it walked. Its head was turned at an odd angle, as if it was broken. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything went still again. My breath came out in ragged gasps, my heart thudding so loudly in my chest I was sure whatever that thing was could hear it. Then, in a sudden jerk, the figure shifted forward, its limbs moving in sharp, unnatural bursts. It was coming towards me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. My foot hit something hard, and I fell, the lantern clattering to the ground beside me. The light flickered wildly, casting long, chaotic shadows all around me. Scrambling to my feet, I snatched up the lantern, holding it close like it was my only lifeline. The figure had stopped moving, but it was closer now. I could see more details. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its bones. Its mouth hung open, too wide, as if it had been unhinged. I took a step back and then another, but every step I took seemed to be met with the thing taking one forward. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was stalking me, playing with me. Then I remembered the stories. The man with the lantern, the disappearances, the void, and suddenly it all clicked. I wasn't in the same place anymore. This wasn't the street, the neighborhood, or even my town. This was somewhere else the man had brought me to. And whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand, its light dancing across the darkness. I had no idea where I was going. There were no landmarks, no streets, just endless black stretching in every direction. But I had to get away. I had to escape whatever was out there. Behind me, I heard the sound again. The tapping. Louder now. Closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly screamed. The figure was sprinting towards me, its limbs jerking and twitching with unnatural speed. Its face, God, its face was twisted into an expression of pure hunger. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The darkness seemed endless, but something deep down told me if I stopped, if I let it catch me, there would be no coming back. Then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell. The world spun around me as I tumbled through the darkness, the lantern slipping from my grasp. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was knocked from my lungs as I hit something hard, and everything went black again. For a long time, I was surrounded by nothing. No light, no sound, just a void. I thought I was dead. Maybe I was dead. But then, faintly, I felt something, a light. I opened my eyes and saw the lantern. Its dim glow barely pierced the surrounding darkness, but it was enough to see that I was no longer falling. I was on solid ground again, though my body ached from the impact. I reached out, grabbing the lantern with shaking hands, and then I heard it again. Tap, 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 closer this time. My heart sank. There was no escape. And then, I realized something even more horrifying. The tapping wasn't coming from the distance anymore. It was coming from right behind me. The sound was unmistakable. That slow, deliberate tapping echoed through the darkness like a heartbeat. Steady, relentless, and impossibly close. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me, but my body moved on instinct, my legs trembling as I twisted around, holding the lantern up as if its fragile light could protect me from what I knew was there. And then I saw him, the man with the lantern. He was different now. He stood only a few feet away, towering over me, His face twisted into that same unnatural grin I had glimpsed earlier, only this time it was even worse. His eyes, deep, black pits, locked onto mine, empty and endless, like staring into the void itself. The lantern he held wasn't glowing. It was as if it had been drained of all light, leaving only cold, suffocating darkness in its wake. "Where are my friends?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His grin widened impossibly, splitting his face in a way that defied logic, as though his mouth could stretch forever. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. In the distance, I heard whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. They grew louder, overlapping, like a chorus of the damned, and I realized with a chill that they were calling my name. "Tommy! Tommy!" The man with the lantern stepped forward, his feet making that same tapping sound on the ground. I took a step back, the lantern shaking in my hands, but I stumbled, my back hitting something cold and hard. A wall? No, there were no walls here, no structures, just darkness. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was cornered. I looked down at the lantern in my hands, its dim light flickering weakly, barely holding on. Felt wrong, heavy, almost as if it didn't belong to me, and that's when I understood. I wasn't supposed to have it. He wanted it back. The man stopped just a few feet from me, his head still tilted at that unnatural angle, his black eyes never leaving mine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now I could make out the words more clearly. "Give it to him. Give it back." I shook my head, clutching the lantern tighter. I didn't know why, but some deep, primal part of me screamed that if I gave it to him, if I let him take it, I would be lost. I would be like the others, the ones who had disappeared. "Tommy! Tommy!" The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me like a storm. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the noise, and it was becoming harder to think, harder to breathe. I was drowning in it, in the darkness, in the fear, in the cold that seeped into my bones. The man with the lantern reached out a long, bony hand toward me, his fingers stretching impossibly long, like claws. The lantern in his other hand remained dark, lifeless, as if it was waiting. "Take it," he whispered, his voice low and raspy, like the wind through dead leaves. "It's yours now." My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the lantern. Was this how it worked? Was this how he trapped people? He passed the lantern on to someone else, and when they accepted it, they were doomed to become part of this nightmare. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't want it." But even as I said the words, I could feel it. The weight of the lantern in my hands grew heavier, like it was sinking into me, pulling me down into the darkness. The man's grin widened, and for the first time, I noticed something. His teeth. They were sharp, jagged, like the teeth of a predator, and they gleamed in the faint light of my lantern. "You already took it," he whispered, his voice curling around me like a noose. "There's no going back." Panic surged through me. I had to do something. I had to get rid of it. But how? I couldn't give it to him. I wouldn't give it to him. And then an idea struck me. If the lantern was the key to this whole nightmare, maybe it was also the key to my escape. Without thinking, I raised the lantern high above my head and hurled it to the ground with all my strength. The glass shattered, and for a split second, the light inside flared, bright and blinding. The man with the lantern screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that pierced through the darkness. His body convulsed, twitching and jerking as the light enveloped him. His lantern dropped to the ground, dark and lifeless, as the shadows began to unravel around him, twisting and writhing like smoke. But something was wrong. The light wasn't stopping. It was growing, spreading, burning brighter and brighter until it was too much. I tried to shield my eyes, but the light consumed everything, and all I could hear was the man's scream echoing through the void. Then suddenly it was over. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden stillness. I was standing in the middle of Maple Street again, right in front of the old house. The porch, the door, everything was exactly as it had been before I knocked. My friends were gone. The house was quiet, and in my hand, the lantern was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where the lantern had been, trying to understand what had just happened. My friends were nowhere to be seen. The street was empty, eerily silent. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, as if the town itself was holding its breath. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A faint glow, far down the street, barely visible in the thickening fog. It was a lantern. The man with the lantern. He wasn't done with me yet.